All right, well, so we have an article written by Hop Hopkins, who's the Strategic Partnership Director for the Sierra Club, entitled Racism is Killing the Planet. And I've been discussing it with all my environmental science students. And really, I think it's something that we should all be discussing and hopefully are already. But I wanted to chat about it with y'all. Before we do that, though, a couple things to touch base on. We're going to be moving into chapter 6 today. All right. So anyway, when you do get access to the text, we're moving into chapter 6 today. So we talked a little bit the other day about environmental justice and this idea that people should not be exposed to varying levels of environmental hazard based on their race, ethnicity, income level, any of these things. And we talked about a clear example of where race, environmental justice is not the case, and that relates to exposure to pollution, where your exposure to pollution depends both on your household income and on your race. And I wanted to share one other example. We normally talk about this later on in the semester, and when we discuss climate change, we look at climatological data and a lot of things. But then we circle back to this idea of justice and equity. And so I just wanted to share this picture because I think this article by Hopkins sort of assumes that we're familiar with some of these environmental crises, and we're not so much yet. So I just wanted to share one other example. This is a map that was created by Jonathan Patz at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so they're maps of the world that are modified. And on the top panel, countries are expanded in proportion to their carbon emissions, to the amount of CO2 that they produce annually. And when you look at that, the countries that grow larger are, of course, US, countries in Western Europe, China as well. And you can see countries like Africa and South America shrink countries. Continents like Africa and South America shrink down because they're not producing a whole lot of carbon. On the other hand, when we look at where mortality is predicted to occur based on climate change, based on where it's supposed to get hotter and drier, how that's going to affect agricultural production, those sorts of things, the countries that are predicted to suffer the most from climate change are those all throughout Africa, India, some other Asian countries. And these countries that are producing the most CO2 shrink way down. So really the take-home message here is that the countries that are contributing the most to climate change are not those that are expected to really suffer the most consequences of it. And so there's a disconnect there, right? So these issues of equity occur, both within countries, as Hopkins talks a lot about, but then even across countries around the world, what we might call the global north and the global south are at very different places when it comes to causes and potential impacts of climate change. All right. So against that backdrop, Hopkins asks, why is racism something that we need to be thinking about when it comes to the environment? And so I have a few discussion questions here. We can go through some of these or none of these, kind of depending on where you want to go with this. But maybe I'll just start by asking, what were your thoughts or any questions that came up as you were reading this article? So when you hear the word ethics, what comes to mind? Morals? What else? Oh, it's like animal testing and things like that? Uh-huh, sure. Mm-hmm. Can you say that again? Rules you live your life by. Mm-hmm. Does that sum it up? Anything else? Cool. So, I mean, in general, ethics are just figuring out what's good or bad, right or wrong. So yeah, if it's something that you live your life by, things that other people live their life by, how do you know if something is okay to do or something isn't okay to do? And so we can talk about a relativist ethical worldview as opposed to a universalist ethical worldview. Any ideas on what those two might be, what the difference might be between those two? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so relativist is this idea that what's right or wrong varies with the context, right? The social context. In other words, something might be okay to do in one context, but then not okay in another. Any examples of that come to mind? Something that would be okay to do in one context, but not in another? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so killing someone after they've tried to take your life as opposed to killing someone out of spite or whatever. Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. And we could probably think of other examples too, right? And so so that contrasts then with universalist, which is the idea that like no matter where you are and what situation, what's right and wrong remains the same. So there are those who say it's better to be killed than to kill. And so, you know, with that kind of a worldview, well then, you know, self-defense, you know, maybe is not a reason for taking a life, but others would say it's relative, right? So, yeah. So that's one thing to keep in mind, first of all, right, is that the things that we think are right or wrong, you know, some of those things we might consider to be wrong in all cases. Can anybody think of something that is wrong in all cases? We could probably think of unfortunate criminal examples, I suppose, but there certainly could be some, right? But it can kind of break down this way. All right. So to help us decide what's right and wrong, we need some standards. We need something to go to that's going to tell us what's right and wrong. So those are our ethical standards. What are some examples of some ethical standards? What are things that people use to tell them right versus wrong? Mm-hmm, absolutely, yeah, religious texts for sure. The law of the land. Mm-hmm. What else? When you're thinking about something, you know, should I do this or not? What do you fall back on to tell you right or wrong? Okay, so yeah, just sort of figuring like kind of what's important to you and how much you value different. Your conscience. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting one, right? Yeah, like if we know something's wrong. Yeah. Yep. I agree. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Yeah, absolutely. There's a name for that. The golden rule. And it's so interesting, I don't know, somebody mentioned religious texts. It's so interesting that like the golden rule or something similar to it is found in like pretty much all religious texts. It's really interesting. So just a couple examples. So I put the golden rule in there. This idea of virtue, I don't know, this comes from like the Greek virtue, you know, that there's sort of a societal standard, kind of like the right and wrong, the law of the land that was mentioned. By the way, the thing about the golden rule, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. That works great unless what is the case? They want to be treated different. Right? So right. So there's one, right? Eye for an eye, right? Like if, what's the quote from the musical Fiddler on the Roof? An eye for an eye, and a tooth for tooth leaves everyone blind and toothless, right? So there's that. It works great as long as everyone wants to be treated the same way that you do, right? And then if they don't, that's where it gets a little funky when you move across cultures and all that. This last one here, which I chose an awful color for, this says utility. This is an ethical concept that says that the thing that's right produces the most benefits for the most people. Utility, U-T-I-L-I-T-Y. And I also put in here the 7 generations principle. Some Native American teachings say that before you make a decision, you should think about how it will affect people 7 generations from now, right? So clearly that's a very different way of thinking about things as opposed to like, what do we need right now? So we've got all these different ethical standards, right? And so each of us kind of in our own context, in our own way has decided, right, which of these to follow. See a couple folks still writing, so I'll pause for a moment. I can get excited and start moving fast if I'm not careful. I feel like all these things we're talking about today, you didn't necessarily anticipate to be talking about in an environmental science class, but yeah, we're setting the groundwork here. We're setting the groundwork. So we can use all these different ideas to decide what's right and what's wrong. So what we're doing then with environmental ethics then is trying to come up with a way to decide good and bad, right and wrong when it comes to our environment. And of course, the thing is, most ethics are framed in the context of interactions between people. And as we talked about the other day in class, our environment is composed of all different things. It's composed of course, all different living components, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi. How does this affect fungi? Don't ask that question too often. Saw a lot of fungi on our hike the other day. Yesterday, actually, seems like a lot longer than that. So we've got all these human and non-human entities in our environment. So how do we think about those entities ethically when we're trying to decide questions about environmental policy, or just like how to think about our environment? So can anybody think of some kinds of questions that come up in our society that we would benefit from an environmental ethic to decide what to do? Some questions that might not be easy to answer. What kind of questions might we be thinking about? Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Where are we gonna put these? The coal burning power plants or the landfills or whatever else? Absolutely. What else? Okay, yeah, so questions of deforestation. Yeah, how are we going to deal with that? So I just came up with a couple examples. Y'all don't have to write these down, but y'all had some great examples, and a couple other ones that might come up. You know, is it okay to destroy a forest if it creates jobs for people? You know, is that okay? How would we go about deciding that, right? Should humans drive other species to extinction? The question of like valuing different species, right? Is it okay? Like, what does that look like? I always think it's kind of scary when other species start going extinct because we rely on the environment just like they do. Is it okay for some communities to be exposed to excess pollution, which we've been talking about quite a bit already? Your broader question, right? Should we conserve resources for future generations? Should we be thinking about our grandkids or their grandkids or their grandkids, right? Like, these questions really go down the years. So as we think about these, what criteria are we going to use to decide a proper course of action? Right. So I'd like to share a couple examples of environmental ethics that folks have thought about, and some of the more common ones, more popular ones. And then I have a bit of a diversion on one of these too, which I hope we'll get to. And so the first environmental ethic to discuss is the preservation ethic. And this was really articulated by John Muir. How many of you all have heard of John Muir before? Several folks? Yeah, so he was the founder of the Sierra Club around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, and a real influential voice. He and Teddy Roosevelt were quite close. And there's kind of a funny story when Roosevelt was campaigning for the White House. He was in California, and there was one of those, like, I don't know, now they're like $10,000 a plate dinners. Back then they were like, I don't know, $100 a plate dinners to raise funds for his campaign. But he and Muir liked to hang out, and they liked to go camping. So when he was out in California, they went out camping. Then it comes time for this, big wig fundraiser dinner, and Roosevelt's gone. They're like, where the heck is Roosevelt? I don't know. Do you know where he is? No, I haven't seen him. Have you seen him? No, I thought you knew where he was. I don't know. Well, they probably didn't say that. But you went camping with Muir and just like skipped out on the whole dinner. He's like, I just want to go camping. So it's a different age. But this idea of the preservation ethic is that nature has its own inherent value. Like, we don't need to calculate an economic value. Just unspoiled nature has its own value just because it exists. So we can talk about this as ecocentrism. So eco meaning the ecosystem, centrism, of course, just centered on it or focused on it. So this is an environmental ethic that really doesn't even relate to people. I mean, it's saying, regardless of how much this ecosystem matters to people, it has value just because it's a natural ecosystem. A couple quotes from Muir, and you don't need to write these down. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. And then perhaps Muir's most famous quote, y'all may have heard this, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So this idea that there's this universe, this huge ecosystem that we're part of, and that it's all connected. And so inherent in that is this idea that when we start messing with things, we're going to mess with other things too. Now, I've told you a little bit about Muir, and I need to tell you one more thing about Muir. First thing I would say is that, unfortunately, these are going to be pictures of white men when we talk about the history of environmental ethics, because by and large, those were the folks who were studying and talking about it, and that's just an unfortunate consequence of the way things were then. But the Sierra Club has had quite a bit of work thinking about its own history. And as they say here, right, in this, well, I don't know if you can read that. They say, as defenders of Black life pull down Confederate monuments across the country, we must also take this moment to re-examine our past and our substantial role in perpetuating white supremacy. And as they say, the most monumental figure in the Sierra Club's past is John Muir. Beloved by many of our members, his writings taught generations of people to see the sacredness of nature. But Muir maintained friendships with people like Henry Fairfield Osborn, who worked for both the conservation of nature and the conservation of the white race. This person was head of the New York Zoological Society and helped found the American Eugenics Society, which was a disgusting way to sort of essentially sterilize those who should not be having children. And by and large, you were likely to find yourself in that category if you were African American or Native American. So this sort of, you know, sad history. And so Muir, toward the end of his life, he changed his ideas somewhat, but he was not someone who was an advocate of racial harmony or of racial equality. And so I just, you know, so the Sierra Club felt the need to come out and say this, just so that we realize that these figures are flawed, right? And that we would like to think that we would think differently if we lived in that time. But regardless, when you look at several of the folks that were involved in the early environmental movement, it was not a pretty story. There's one more quote here I wanted to say. Yeah, and then the Sierra Club goes on to talk about how they're redesigning their leadership structure so that Black, Indigenous, and other leaders of color at the Sierra Club make up the majority of the team, making top-level organizational decisions. This idea of elevating the voices and experiences of staff of color. You know, they talk very much about how like, in some ways, Muir and some of these other folks' association with the Sierra Club may have created an environment where Indigenous people and people of color can feel hurt or alienated when interacting with the Sierra Club. So we got a lot to unpack. We got a lot to unpack in this society and a lot of work to do for sure. So the Sierra Club, like, and it's interesting too, you know, the journal that I published the research of my master's thesis in, they're changing the name of it because the guy that it's named after, it turned out was quite a racist person and did some really bad things. So it's crazy as we're learning all these things, like we're turning over rocks and learning unpleasant things. And of course, we got a ton of work to do in our day and age now. Okay, so we had the preservation ethic. Then the next one I'd like to mention is the conservation ethic. And this was really first articulated by Gifford Pinchot, who was the first head of the US Forest Service in the early 20th century. And he said that we should conserve the environment, but for a very different reason. He said we should use natural resources wisely for the greatest good for the most people. So this is what we might call an anthropocentric ethical view. So anthro, of course, referring to people. So the idea is like, yeah, you know, we should conserve nature, but like because we need it, right? Because we need it to survive. Again, I still see a couple people writing, so I will pause briefly. So this kind of lines up with one of the ethical standards that we mentioned earlier. Do you remember which one? The greatest good for the greatest number of people? Utility. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is definitely in line with the concept of utility. Here are a couple quotes from Pinchot. How many of y'all have heard of Pinchot before? Sometimes his writings are used in various venues. Okay. It says, conservation means the wise use of the earth and its resources for the lasting good of men. Again, didn't feel the need to add in women there. Unless we practice conservation, those who come after us will have to pay the price of misery, degradation, and failure for the progress and prosperity of our day. So that was said between 1900 and 1910, right? But certainly something that resonates today, you know, over a century later. Okay, and the final one I'll mention is called the land ethic. This was articulated by Aldo Leopold. He wrote the first textbook on wildlife management, was really a pioneer of ecology. He wrote this poem called The Fierce Green Fire, where he talks about back in the day when people managed land, one of the main things they did was to kill off predators. And so he talks about, you know, shooting a wolf and seeing this strange green, this fierce green fire in its eyes, that it was like this energy, and you know, really revolutionized what we know about ecosystems. But so the land ethic is the idea that nature is kind of like an organism in that all the parts have to be working together, right? That when we think about what's right, we have to consider all the different parts of nature and how they work together. There's a couple quotes from Leopold. It says, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Then he says, "Harmony with land is like harmony with a friend. You cannot cherish his right hand and chop off his left." Now when I read this, I think of the idea of sacrifice zones now, right? And how Hopkins laid that out. We can't be degrading the land over here and the people over here and still cherish the rest of it. And so anyway, we've circled back to this idea of environmental justice again. And just a stat for you, 75% of toxic waste landfills in the southeastern US are in communities with above average proportion of racial minorities. So this theme will definitely come back to us in this course. So I really appreciate y'all kind of diving into a serious topic here early on with me. I hope that we can keep these issues kind of in the forefront of our minds as we go through the semester. I really appreciate how y'all are participating in class. I know this is a big group of people to feel comfortable sharing our ideas in. I hope you continue to learn that this is a setting where we want to hear from everybody, and I really appreciate sharing your ideas. And I will look forward to seeing y'all on Wednesday. We also do have a reading on Moodle for Wednesday, okay? So be sure and log in and take a look at that, okay? All right, have a great couple of days, everybody.